So China is now pressing Taiwan, pressing a lot of Chinese people as well as their own people in mainland China. They are pressing democracy, and over 3 decades, the Chinese overseas, a lot of you, have been working on fighting against China, against CCP. But so far, not a lot of progress has been made overseas. And I don't think we're getting anywhere now. So if we use the same kind of method, we only get the same kind of result. So I think that change must be made. And what kind of change? We should ask ourselves, why do we have to fight against CCP? Because we want democracy. Why do we want democracy? Because we want freedom. So freedom is the goal. We are seeking for human rights, and democracy is the process. So using the method, a system, a perfect system, and through democracy, and over here I mark everlasting democracy, we will achieve the goal of freedom. And through that, we will live in permanent peace. So what kind of system? What kind of change? Instead of fighting against the CCP, which will only provoke them, and will provoke them to press us and press the Chinese people stronger, why don't we help the CCP? And how do we help them on their way to democracy? Over here, we present a new perspective. We provide a system, a perfect system, that the 249 political entities, including Taiwan, including a lot of little countries, including Tibet, they can operate independently and permanently. We believe that through that, by the road, supporting Taiwan to demonstrate this perfect system, more and more countries will join us, and we can lure the Chinese people to follow. This will attract attention worldwide, and only through that, we can press and put more pressure on the CCP that they must change. They must change and walk ahead. So little by little, with the attention of worldwide, China will be on its way to democracy, and we will be on our way to real freedom. And only through that, world peace will be achieved. So at last, in peace we trust. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Liao. So this session is over, and I continue to host this the next panel, the first panel for the discussion, because of the time frame. So I would like to invite Ms. Sophie York, the first speaker for this this panel. Okay, Sophie, it is yours. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much, Jin Chen, for inviting me. Jin Chen is the president of the Federation for a Democratic China, as you all know. And what I'll do is talk about the South China Seas, because I believe that this has precipitated many of the issues in Australia right now. I do wish to say at the outset that my views expressed here today are not necessarily those of the Australian Defence Force. I am in the Navy Reserve, but these are my views as a mere observer, and I'm a legal philosopher first and foremost. I'm also the lead Senate candidate for the Australian Conservatives, and we are calling for a Royal Commission into the activities of China in Australia. None of the material I'll talk about is classified. It's all being reported in the press at some stage. And I do recommend, if you're interested in this topic, the reading of Silent Invasion by Professor Clive Hamilton. Ladies and gentlemen, I would normally stay for questions afterwards, but I do have to attend a funeral, so I apologise for that. I will need to leave straight away. A lot has happened in the last few years which is relevant to the South China Sea's issues. People are sensing that there are movements grabbing for power in the West, from Islamism to the Chinese Communist government to Brussels via the EU and so on. And people are noticing and they are choosing freedom. But the politicians in Australia and across the West have only recently started listening, and many of those politicians are not savvy or strong enough to act. Everything global is changing constantly, and it was doing so even as I prepared this talk. One of the most significant changes in the world power stakes was that in 2017, when we gained a new leader, President Trump. He was inaugurated in 2017, of the most dominant country in the world, militarily, culturally, and economically. The US spends more on defence than the next 7 countries in the world combined. And that list includes rivals such as China and Russia. The US has more aircraft, tanks, ships, submarines, and aircraft carriers, superior technology, a large force of 1.4 million well-trained personnel, and the world's largest nuclear arsenal. President Trump has indicated that he will not operate as per past US leaders, and this unpredictability means that rivals for power have to rethink their strategies for engagement. Legendary Chinese war general Sun Tzu would regard this as a wise strategy to keep opponents unprepared and the plans as impenetrable as night, and that all has an impact on our topic today. Trump has also put in place what is being described as a trade war against China, but when you consider that America has 130 billion US dollars skin in the game, whereas China has actually 500 billion US dollars in the game, China is actually far more exposed. So really, it's a war that's already been won by America. We'll continue to watch how it unfolds. By the way, this may present some market opportunities for Australia, but we need not sell our soul nor our future in the process. On Friday, the 5th of May 2017, Trump met with our then Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, on the deck of the USS Intrepid to mark the 75th anniversary of the Battle of the Coral Sea, which took place in May 1942. The Japanese had already bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941 to take out a major chunk of Allied shipping, and bombed Darwin in February 1942, where more than 250 people were killed and hundreds more Australians were wounded. Quite simply, the Japanese were trying to extend their empire southward. And Darwin, strategically important because of it being the entry point at the top of Australia, was poorly defended. The Coral Sea battle was a showdown, which the Allies won. And this was pivotal in the course of the war and the eventual victory by the Allied forces. The Japanese were rebuilt with Allied money after the war, and today are our firm friends who share our stance on democracy, rule of law, and human rights. Japan is also our second largest trading partner. The top 4, as you know, are China, Japan, the US, and South Korea. Now, as a legal philosopher, I'm interested in the underlying philosophical currents which guide surface behaviour. My goal today is just to make you aware of the significance of the issue in the South China Seas, as, once again, long after World War II, this area, this region, is now in the hot seat. I want to also emphasise that we all have the goal of world peace. War is horrific and it must be avoided. But acknowledging the horror of war does not mean capitulation or appeasement. And it does not mean the sacrifice of national sovereignty. Quite the opposite. In fact, capitulation usually only means short-term peace for long-term loss of freedom and eventual conflict in any event. Peace can be maintained, using methods apart from simply doing what the other country wants. You make it in their interest to respect you and to want an ongoing relationship with you. Then you will have peace. So you're essentially teaching them the benefits of peace, because each generation that hasn't suffered war forgets the lesson. Sunday, by the way, marks the anniversary of the end of World War I. That war was actually called the Great War, and then it had to be renamed because we forgot, and we had another World War. It's madness. The development of the concept of just war, a war which can be undertaken because it's morally justified, was a term coined by eminent legal scholar Augustine of Hippo around 400 AD, and then it was refined by Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s AD. War could be morally justifiable if waged by a proper authority, such as a nation, for a good and just purpose. So not for self-gain or power or to gain territory or profit or subjugate people. And very importantly, the conduct of war had to be humane. These latter concepts were codified properly after the Second World War in the Geneva Conventions, due to the efforts of Swiss citizen Jean-Henri Dunant, whose efforts founded the International Committee of the Red Cross. So as Australians, the goal we have is twofold. It is to know what we treasure and why, and secondly, what we must do to preserve it, to clearly define our boundaries and to enforce those boundaries. Long-term peace is a byproduct of that twofold process. In short, we risk a loss of peace and a loss of freedom if we don't know what we treasure. If we don't know what we treasure or why we treasure it, we don't know what we'll do if it's placed at risk. The Chinese have a long association with Australia. They arrived in the gold rush of the 1850s and nowadays comprise about 4% of the Australian population. Chinese people, whether in Australia or China, need to be viewed as separate to the Chinese Communist government, as they're quite different. Humans, we're all human beings, we all crave autonomy. Chinese people are no different. However, because in China they live in a one-party communist state, the Chinese people have no option but to accept this reality and live as best they can within this stricture. Chinese people, whether in China or in Australia, are generally, like all other Australians, hard-working, law-abiding. They are known for being extremely polite and gentle and for loving their families. They suffered immensely in modern history. The rape of Nanking by Iris Chang details the horrors inflicted upon them in World War II by the Japanese. And in a decade of madness, 1966 to 1976, Chairman Mao either directly killed or incited violence against countless thousands of his enemies, and his Great Leap Forward policies caused the deaths of millions of his own people via famine. The figures range from 15 million to 45 million. Yang Jingcheng's book, Tombstone, is regarded as the definitive work on this topic, and as he interviewed eyewitnesses and had access to numerous records, the book is banned in mainland China, a fact I discovered when I went to PAC for travel there. In 1989, as we all know, in a democratic uprising, thousands of Chinese people, including students, were massacred by their own government forces, the People's Liberation Army, in Tiananmen Square. Even one of the most basic natural law human rights, the right to procreate, was controlled for years by the CCP's one-child policy, with people fined or imprisoned for disobedience. And as we know, the policy's been relaxed in the last couple of years due to demography imbalances. Basically, due to sex selection abortions favouring males, it has created a shortfall of an estimated 25 million young men without brides and without any prospect of having a family. This creates a problem of how to occupy those young men. So that's the backdrop. The upside is that China has slowly but steadily moved a large percentage of its population out of poverty and opened itself up to the world market. We can feel very grateful to the Chinese as the migrants here are exemplary citizens, they're our children's friends, they're our own friends and colleagues. And as a nation, Chinese factory workers provide us with many items cheaply, from gadgets to batteries to bath mats, food, furniture, clothing, cosmetics, you name it. However, accompanying that trade relationship has come a growing encroachment on our autonomy, which is typical of the communist government's style. They know no other way. Just as we know a democratic style, they know their style. So the closer their dealings with us and the greater their dealings, the more we would expect to see their controlling influence stamped on the relationship, a point my predecessor speaker mentioned. Australians of Chinese background who left China for the freedom of Australia are acutely aware of this. We're all acutely aware of this. Before I talk about Spratley, I just want to give you a very brief summary of the Law of the Sea, and it might be a refresher for some of you, so I apologise. The Law of the Sea is very simply a body of customs, treaties, international agreements and so forth by which governments of sovereign nations maintain order, productivity, peaceful relationships on the sea. Countries have always explored, they've always traded with each other, and they've always fought each other in history on the ocean using navies and ships. And many practices become entrenched in time and become part of the customary international law. This means that because nations believed it was binding on them, it then becomes part of the opinio juris. So it might be treating a mountain on the border as part of your territory, or it might be fishing in a certain area and regarding that as your fishing grounds and so forth. And the original law of the nations became known as the jus gentium. So all of the territory of the globe is now under the sovereign authority of one of 200 plus nations, and the exception being Antarctica, which has a number of sovereign nations competing over it. So treaties create commitments, and that can include commercial matters. The emergence of the modern concept of a sovereign nation, or state as it is called in international law, was crystallised in the Treaty of Westphalia at the end of the 30 Years' War, so 1618 to 1648. And because it also included the tolerance of religion, it removed a major cause for all the battles which were taking place between the European powers. So basically, war became the tendency to go to war became subordinate to the desire for peace and people's desire for stability. And that became the desired norm, which is a good thing. Now, the two world wars were notable exceptions to that. But just from the perspective of sovereignty, that's been long accepted. But what about the sovereignty over the water, not just the land? I'm just going to put up a picture for you. In fact, I've got a few handouts, so I'll hand them round. Sorry, there's probably only one between two, but so in the 18th century, the so-called cannon shot rule gained wide acceptance in Europe. So coastal states could exercise sovereignty over the water as far as a projectile could be fired from a cannon from land. And that was about 1 marine league, about 3 nautical miles. And countries would have control over whatever happened in those waters, whether it was fishing or piracy or drug smuggling, you name it, pollution, people smuggling, whatever. The coastal country, or coastal state, would have control over what happened in those waters. And post-World War II, we had a series of UN conferences, and by the late 1960s, they trended to this 12 nautical mile territorial sea, and now, of course, that's been codified in UNCLOS 3. So if you just have a look at that, it shows, and I'll try and keep this just to a minimum description. We've got the territorial sea, that's 12 nautical miles out from the baseline, drawn around the country, and in that zone you can control things like drug smuggling, theft, murder, fishing, immigration, sanitation, boating, currency, and all those kinds of things. The contiguous zone is the next zone, and that's 24 nautical miles, and within that it's customs, immigration, etc., sanitation, you name it. And then from the baseline measuring out 200 nautical miles, you've got what's called the exclusive economic zone, the EEZ, and you have sovereignty over resources in that area, and that can include oil exploration, fishing, and so forth. Now, beyond that is the high seas, and everyone's free to use the high seas and the international airspace. In 1965, the General Assembly of the United Nations, by Resolution 2131, declared that no state has the right to intervene directly or indirectly for any reason whatsoever in the internal or external affairs of any other state. And no state is allowed to use any economic, political, or any other type of measures to coerce another state in order to subordinate its exercise of its own sovereign rights or to secure from it advantages of any kind. So this was a reaffirmation of the Westphalian principle. It's a principle of non-interference in other countries' affairs, and it's based on the understanding that no country, no matter how small, how large, is superior in standing. All nations are equal in standing under international law. Very important point. I'm just flagging that so we look at the Spratly Island dispute in context. So anyway, the Spratlys, as you know, fall between the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia, in the EEZ of the Philippines. So they're part of an island chain in the South China Seas, and the Chinese call it if you have a look at that, they call this area the 9-dash line, and they claim that that's their area. It's not, it's actually outside of the area, and it first appeared on a Chinese map in 1948, in fact. The islands were named after a British whaling captain, Richard Spratley, and there's 14 islands, and the contested area includes the Paracel Islands, Spratly Islands, and various other areas, the Pratas Islands, Macclesfield Bank, Scarborough Shoal, etc., etc. The total area of the islands is 1.77 kilometres squared and 2 kilometres squared if you take into account the reclaimed land. So the bottom line for us is that they fall well outside China's EEZ, well outside. That's important from an international law perspective. For the last couple of years, as we know, more than a couple of years, a few years now, China's been cementing over reefs, building up a protrusion and then claiming it as their land. And then, of course, claiming the territorial waters around those protrusions. Now, if land can't have people living on it naturally, then you can't claim it as territory that triggers territorial waters around it. If it's a mere protrusion, and especially a fake one, you can't claim sovereignty. So that's the position. That's a factual position in international law. China has put military installations on 3 big islands called Subi, Mischief and Fiery Cross Reefs, which allow Beijing to deploy fighter jets and mobile missile launchers to the area at any time. All 3 islands have hangars that can accommodate fighter jets and larger planes, including surveillance ones, transport planes, you name it, refuelers. And they've also got these shelters with retractable roofs that can have missile launchers put in them. They also have significant radar and sensory abilities on the islands, and that's all to provide protection against air or missile strikes. So anyway, long story short, Philippines took China to court, and the Court of Arbitration in The Hague, and China refused to appear. And the basis of their claim, which we know from the contents of a note that they sent to the Secretary General of the UN, was that they claimed the area because of fishing and because of their actions in cementing over the reefs. Can you believe it? The Philippines argued that even if China did possess those historic rights, those were extinguished by the formal adoption of UNCLOS 3. And secondly, that on the basis of the historical record in the South China Seas, China simply can't meet the grade. You don't get sovereignty that way. There's a few ways that you do in international law, but that's not how you get it. If you want to know, the accepted methods include cession, where someone cedes authority to you, occupation where there's no sovereign authority, so that's terra nullius and whatever, prescription, adverse possession, conquest, and so forth. Or natural accretion, where land pops up in your waters, and you would have sovereignty over that. But that's not what happened here. So anyway, it's described in the judgment as a crucial shipping lane, a rich fishing ground, home to highly biodiverse coral reef ecosystem, and believed to hold significant oil and gas resources. So it's what they've done here is very significant. It's the most significant thing for all of us is that it's one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. And as far as Australia is concerned, 60% of our export wealth, so 60% of $318 billion pass through those shipping lanes. It's estimated that $5 trillion worth in international shipping goes past us. So whoever has the capacity to disrupt this shipping, even if they never use it, it's enormous leverage. It's a sword of Damocles, if you like. It's enormous unspoken power. Does that make sense? So the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan and Brunei, they all have overlapping claims in the law of the sea territorial claims in this area. Australia's largest export market is China, 32% of total exports, followed by Japan with 16%, South Korea 7%, and the US 5%, and so on. And there's all sorts of products that I mentioned earlier. Now, we have good relationships with all our neighbours in this region, and we train some of their Navy officers, and we do military exercises with their navies, and the Philippines are actually the oldest US ally in the region. So this sea area, if I haven't emphasised it enough, it's very significant to Australia economically, historically, militarily and politically. Okay, so to put all that into a summary, if you're cementing reefs in someone else's waters, you are breaking international law. There needs to be a consequence for that breach. I'll just put up a picture. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is just one of the pictures. I'll show a few more. Now, the difficulty is enforcement in international law. China says it doesn't agree with the finding, and the court does not have its a police force as such. So with international law, it ends up depending on diplomacy and trade and returning ambassadors and all those kinds of things and expressions of displeasure and things like that. It's a tricky situation. So what do we do? Do we go and bomb the islands? No. The UN Charter is very clear on this. The countries affected cannot, as a first measure, go and declare war on China and start bombing the islands. Article 1 of the Charter says that the very purpose of the United Nations is to promote international peace and security. Article 2, subparagraph 3, requires that all members settle their international disputes by peaceful means. Article 33, subsection 1, says that parties to a dispute must first of all seek a resolution by resort to such methods as mediation, arbitration, or judicial settlement. And that has been done. That is what has been done. Article 33, subsection 2, says that the Security Council must, where necessary, call upon the parties to settle their disputes by peaceful means. Now, the difficulty is that the Security Council, if you know the composition of it, we all know it's got 15 member nations, 5 of whom are permanent. The US, the UK, France, Russia, and you guessed it, who else? China. The resolutions require the unanimous vote of the Big Five. So in a crisis, we need to understand that no nation is going to put their entire faith in the Security Council coming to their rescue, and a nation never gives up its right to self-defence. And that right to self-defence is acknowledged in Article 51 of the UN Charter. So yes, the UN Charter forbids preemptive attack and prohibits people going to war, but you actually, as a nation, have the right to self-defence. You're never deprived of that. But you don't want to wait until you're in a position where you can't defend yourself. Does that make sense? So we all want peace, yes, but you know, political and self-interest does come into play. China has experienced famine and it has ambitions of being a world superpower. This is not a secret. If you've read the collection of speeches by President Xi Jinping, The Governance of China, if any of you are familiar with that book, it gives insights into the goals and dreams of the Chinese leadership, and he has secured to himself lifelong tenure and so forth. He talks about the road to rejuvenation and the goal of reform and opening up, and the goal of developing China as a cyber power. And so I'm just touching on various things that he mentioned. And the great renewal of the Chinese nation will be made possible with stronger military forces. And so spreading the reach is not a secret. It's in his speeches and it's in the book. But they did mislead us all by saying that they were not going to militarise these islands. Now, there's a clue there to what's going on. We have been misled on this issue. So then you start wondering, well, can we rely on anything that is said? Perhaps it's to distract us or put us on the wrong path. Now, the level of trade between us and China creates a bit of a mutually assured level of dependence, and Deloitte's in April last year released a report which says that China delivers Australia $100 billion boost to our national income, and that if China was to fall into recession, 500,000 jobs in Australia would be wiped out. So that's concerning. The flow-on would hit house prices and the share market and the strength of our currency and so on, and that this deep reliance on China actually creates a vulnerability. And the report also says that we don't, you know, because we've sort of put all our eggs in one basket, we don't really have the ability to resist the economic shocks that any destabilisation might cause us. The 10-member ASEAN, that Association of Southeast Nations, Asian nations, met in April 2017 in Manila and in Australia in 2018. The topic was the South China Seas, as well as the murderous regime of the President of the Philippines, who didn't attend, by the way, and that was significant. Why didn't he attend? The Philippines is the longest-standing US ally. We all know what he's been up to. He's a murderous dictator. We know he's killed thousands of his own citizens. And we also know, and this is important, that he's been dialoguing with China, and he came out and said at the end of 2017, America has lost. Don't worry about what his people think or about this long-standing alliance with the leader of the free world. Oh no, he's been bought off, essentially. It's clear as day. So the case against China was actually brought by the former president of the Philippines, just so you're clear. Anyway, there's been a number of moves by ASEAN members to have stronger ties with Australia, and that's very significant. The president of Indonesia, the president of Vietnam, and so forth. And one of the first things that the new Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, did was visit Indonesia, just to strengthen our relationship there. Commodore Agus Rustandi, R-U-S-T-A-N-D-I, Head of Defence Strategic Research in the Indonesian Ministry of Defence, pointed out that China is prepared to disregard international law, jeopardise the maintenance of regional order, and abandon its obligations to abide by regional as well as international mechanisms. And that China, far from taking responsibility for the tensions that it's created in the South China Seas, is ironically running around blaming other people and saying that they shouldn't butt in, and why is everyone becoming aggressive and unfriendly? What's that about? Well, there's a clue right there. And it's so ironic. This is such an unfriendly act and an inexplicable act. And anyway, in 2015, China's President Xi Jinping told the UN General Assembly that China will never pursue hegemony or expansion of sphere of influence. Told the UN General Assembly that. Does he not know what is happening? words, but the words do not match the actions that we can see taking place. Rustandi's view is that a negotiated outcome by ASEAN nations with China is unlikely, but he offers a bit of hope, saying that perhaps a joint development of resources might still be on the table, and that could still lead to a peaceful outcome. Other matters taking place include that Australia joined the Beijing-based Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We signed up in June 2015 and we contributed close to $1 billion, so around 930 million. And the purpose, the alleged or stated purpose, is to build infrastructure and put in clean energy sources in our region, and 57 members have signed up. Now, the plans are meant to be that if you lift the standard of living in our region, then that's an investment in peace, which is meant to be a good thing, and the neighbouring nations all become middle class over time and less likely to become failed states marked by poverty and internal conflict and terrorism and all those kinds of things. But the philosophical questions, seeing we're in a theatre of philosophy right now, significant philosophical questions are, well, can we actually function successfully as a peaceful globe if nations flout international law and refuse to be bound by it, and there's no consequences? That leads to failure or collapse of a system of law. And what if no nation has the guts to take this forward? The court found in favour of the Philippines. What's happening? Quick as a flash, what's happening? What's happening? What's the consequence? China's ignored the finding, now what? Now what? We're talking about the system of international law. Enforcement is critical to maintain a system which will give us peace. This is a domestic principle as well as an international principle. So what are the chances of any formal enforcement given China is a member of the Big Five on the Security Council? I'm just putting those questions out there. I mean, these are obvious questions, but we need to find answers. The US and Australia are currently conducting freedom of navigation operations, you'd be aware, through that area. They're called FONOPs, and that's a way of signalling that they are free to go through that area, no matter who's cemented and militarised what. Interesting that environmentalists haven't kicked up a fuss about this cementing over reefs, isn't it? Fascinating. Yeah. Trump signalled to the world the significance of the alliance that was forged in that Battle of the Coral Sea, and he said at the dinner, he said, "We affirmed the tremendous friendship between the US and Australia. The armed forces are fighting side by side to defeat ISIS and the scourge of terrorism. We will eradicate terrorism, etc., etc." And the South China Sea sub-issue, not a sub-issue, it was the subtext of that dinner, that we are allies for all purposes. We fought and died alongside each other. That is very powerful, very powerful. The US has focused attention on China's backyard, and that's clever. The dictatorship North Korea, to make it plain to the world whose side China is really on. China is North Korea's, the reclusive North Korea's principal trading partner. They rely on China for survival, and that gives China immense clout over them. In short, unless China reigns in North Korea, China would look like it's not on board with freedom-loving, progressive, modern nations. So it's looking though it's siding with backward, pugilistic dictatorships. That's not a good look. That's not a good look. And of course we know that playing the role of bad boy for China, Kim Jong-un dutifully marked the 85th anniversary of the foundation of the Korean People's Army with the launch of a test missile, as you do. And it fizzled on launch, and we now know that that was possibly done remotely by the Americans via their advanced cyber technology. Trump met with Kim Jong-un, as we all know, on the 12th of June 2018, and a denuclearisation of the Korean Peninsula was agreed, and the two leaders of both North and South Korea met and embraced in front of the whole world. The whole world. So this is very significant, and we all have a watching brief on what happens next. Meanwhile, in support of the US and the Australian FONOPs through that area, a number of countries have joined in, including Japan and France. But we in Australia were a bit slow to react to what was happening in our own region, these significant developments in our own region. Now, should we be concerned about China? Should we be concerned?
Yes.
I'm seeing nods, so I'm going to say that yes. Well, let's unpack it. China has a population of 1.37 billion, probably plus by the time I finish this talk. One of its main concerns is future food and energy security and avoiding social unrest. China looks long term. It is one of the oldest continuing civilizations on earth, as you know, 5,000 years plus. The Chinese won't stop trading with us if we assert ourselves. They respect boundaries, but not if the boundaries are never asserted. Not if the boundaries are never asserted. They've made important strategic acquisitions in Australia. The Port of Darwin, the topmost entry point of Australia. Long-term lease, 99 years, that's the Landbridge group. That, by the way, the chairman is actually a Communist Party official. The Port of Newcastle by the Infrastructure Fund and China Merchants Group. The Port of Melbourne by the Lonsdale Consortium. And other strategic acquisitions include Cubby Station in Queensland. It's the largest irrigation property in the Southern Hemisphere. Food supply includes Australia's largest dairy farm that's been acquired that's in Tasmania. It was sold to Chinese buyers. And that was, by the way, one of the biggest agricultural sales in Australia ever. And this is massive, what's happening, massive. And one of the buyers is actually a deputy of the Chinese National People's Congress. How fascinating is that? Australia's biggest beef station is now owned by a Chinese company. Fortunately, half of it is owned by an Australian businesswoman, Gina Reinhardt. There's been a number of Chinese purchase attempts which have been unsuccessful. I do want to show that there is a certain waking up going on in Australia, and the Foreign Investment Review Board has decided that some acquisitions are not in our national interest. So we know that the iron ore bid by Chinalco, do you remember that one? Yeah, that failed, and the Chinese went and bought Vale in Brazil. The Grain Corp bid, you remember that one? That failed as well on national security grounds. And Huawei recently, you're aware of that? They wanted to buy the 5G telecommunications network. And the most recent news is that the CK didn't get APA. They wanted to get the $13 billion gas transmission pipelines. And that, as of this week, that was blocked on national security grounds. So these essential services should not fall into foreign countries' hands. They are essential services to our country. Whoever controls them essentially controls us. It's so important. But let's hear what they do control when we're talking about essential services. CKI and State Grid, it's Chinese companies, control 100% of electricity transmission and distribution assets in Victoria, South Australia and ACT. I mean, it's very significant what's going on here. I mean, okay, so this month we've heard good and bad news. Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews has significantly damaged Australia's national interests by his, I'm going to call it a wacky loner decision to sign up to China's Belt and Road Initiative. In Australia, national security is of national concern. It's not something that states go out on a frolic of their own and put at risk. That's not what should happen. And anyway, he hasn't disclosed what the terms of it are, so we're all just flying blind on that issue. The One Belt, One Road initiative, by the way, it relies on extending loans to developing countries in our regions, and if they can't repay them, then what? I mean, the Chinese Communist government then has control over them. It's a classic debt trap, classic. The Lowy Institute estimated that between 2006 and 2016, China provided $1.7 billion to fund 218 projects in the Pacific region. What also happened this week, as you will be aware as headline news, is that our Prime Minister has just announced that we are going to spend $3 billion Australian dollars on infrastructure projects and military training in our region. So it's become a bit of a, we're going to outspend you. But we've got the long-standing relationships, and this is our region, and these are our long-standing friends, and so forth. Okay, okay, we've covered all that, all right. Okay, now, as you know, also China legislated that companies in Australia, if they're required to assist the Chinese Communist Party, they must provide that assistance. That means that China's national interest would take precedence over ours. That's a very important point that we have to bear in mind. When I asked earlier, we must know what we treasure and why, our rule of law, our Judeo-Christian heritage, our democracy, all these things that guarantee our individual freedom, these treasures comprise the answer to all these issues. All these issues. Our criminal law accords due process, and the idea of habeas corpus that's derived from our British heritage, and it's recorded in Magna Carta of 1215, and underpinning it is that every person has equal human dignity, individual human dignity. They can't lose liberty on anyone else's whim, allegation, vendetta, whatever. And that differs to a system which is based on a collectivist ideology, which says that some are more equal than others. Our tort law incorporates the concept of the Good Samaritan, that you look out for others, and our contract law is based on do unto others, so it's based on fairness. These are all Judeo-Christian concepts which permeate our system and differ greatly from the communist system. The Five Eyes, you'll be aware, the intelligence sharing group, all those Five Eyes countries, Australia, New Zealand, US, UK and Canada, they all share a foundational belief in these concepts. Does that make sense? They all share that. In 1999, Jason Yatsen-Lee was a leading person in the effort to make Australia the People's Republic of Australia. Fortunately, the Australian people decided overwhelmingly to keep the status quo of a constitutional monarchy. He, by the way, later ran as a candidate in Bennelong. You might be aware that he was beaten by John Alexander. And he recently spoke, Jason Yatsen-Lee recently spoke at the ABC in a panel. And I was fascinated to see that he tried to blur any criticism of the Chinese Communist government with racism against Chinese people. And that's a tactic. If someone's doing that, immediately you know that they're probably an agent for the CCP, because they know that all at once people will back away, because who wants to be called that? Who wants to be regarded as mean or racist or whatever? So it's a way of silencing people from criticising wrongful action by the CCP. Is that clear? Does that make sense? Yes. Okay, great. So to return to the question, should we be concerned? My view is yes, and I can see that some of you are nodding. Yes. I haven't reached this conclusion lightly, by the way. It's been after listening to Australians of Chinese background and some Tibetan and other backgrounds where they care about democracy and that nations of the world who care about individual liberty need to support each other in that. I'm seeing big nods. Now, the Chinese have not explained why they're militarising this region, and they have not explained why they're taking over so many of our key assets, and we're left to make our own deductions about it. And our assumptions to date have been that, yes, they're our friends with our best interests at heart. That was our initial assumption, but friends don't arm themselves to the teeth with no explanation. What friends do that? And this matter all became headline news when a federal senator in the ALP sent his excess travel bill, you might remember this, to Top Education Institute, the Chinese institute. They paid it in full. And that outfit, by the way, is run by a delegate of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the CPPCC, which is a Communist Party People's Forum. This senator also quizzed senior defence and DFAT officials about Australia's stance in the South China Seas. He also tipped off a Chinese businessman that the businessman was being monitored by ASIO. And I mean, that's something that he, as a senator, would have had top-level security clearance for. We know that millions of dollars have been donated by Chinese interests to both Labor and the coalition between 2013 and 2015, and since then, our federal government has enacted the Foreign Influence Transparency Bill, and that's a very good idea, very good idea. This is what should happen. There should also be a database so that we all know what level of foreign ownership there is in Australia. There should be much more transparency. In fact, there shouldn't be foreign ownership. That's my view. There's no reciprocity, so why should there be? Why should there be? In recent years, China wanted Australia to sign an extradition treaty which would have given China sovereignty over nationals on our soil. They have capital punishment over there. This is significant. Apparently they detained Professor Zhong Yifeng at the time, thinking that that would make us think, oh, well, we should sign this treaty. I think it might have had the opposite effect. They're going to detain people and rob them of their rights. Why would we ever hand over anyone to them? But anyway. So this means that they could fabricate charges in China on political grounds to, you know, people who are criticising the Chinese government in China, and then we would have to hand over, people criticising the CCP in Australia, and we would have to hand them over to China. We would have to hand them over, and the Chinese legal system is not renowned for due process or assumption of innocence, presumption of innocence, and it's not renowned for judicial independence. I'm happy to be corrected if they do have complete judicial independence, and they're not renowned for a free press. And again, I'm happy to be corrected if they do in fact have a free press. But and also the treatment of prisoners is not always humane. I mean, you will be aware of the organ harvesting and the executions and so forth. So sometimes these things are political conclusions, not fair judgments after due process in the legal system. That's all I'm saying. We know that China's building up its own military forces. They launched their first domestically built aircraft carrier in the last 12 months, and they now have 2, the US has 11. And we know that China's doing military exercises with Russia. There's 2 important things with which China ought to be taken into account, and that is that their culture is an ancient, civilised one, and that communism is actually only a blip in Chinese history. It's only a blip. Human beings crave freedom. There are now push factors which hopefully over time will topple the CCP. It'll be unrest coming from unresolved poverty issues and all the blokes who can't get a bride and a growing middle class who don't want authoritarianism. Who would want it? Who would want it? Also, they've introduced a social credit system. I'm sure you're all aware of that. It's basically monitoring everybody and giving them credit or taking credit from them if they do things like criticise the government and so forth, or I don't know, not buy nappies for their baby, or whatever the basis is. But the bottom line is it's very disturbing because that level of monitoring is very controlling, and no other nation's people, the Chinese don't want to live under it either. No one wants to live under that. No one. Hands up anyone who wants to live under that. There's not one hand going up. Thank you. Now, the irony here is that the clue to China solving the Spratly Island issue and its expansionism lies in their friendly cooperation with other markets and not alienating the rest of the world, whom they depend upon for customers of their product. They depend on those markets. An international boycott would actually cripple China. That's fair, don't you think? That's what would happen. So it wouldn't necessarily cripple other countries, by the way. They can seek markets elsewhere, but it would cripple China. They're at the level, and that consciousness needs to be something that they absorb in deciding on their behaviour. Trump's instincts, by the way, putting tariffs on China's exports to the US are an important way of reminding them that there may be not a world police force, But there are ways of making nations behave themselves and not do cyber hacking and not do intellectual property theft and so forth. Most empires have nations wanting what the empire has to offer. So whether, we'll talk about the British Empire, people wanted what it had to offer. The language and the standards and the manners and the high quality, people wanted that. We Australians treasure the rule of law and democracy, and we have a very laid-back lifestyle, and we dislike being taken advantage of, and our history shows that we have a dislike for being told what to do. I am going to wrap up shortly. Just on the home stretch now, you've been very patient, but I'm just going to show you what I think what we could do is offer to have a shared base, share these resources here. We could have our personnel work alongside them. They could perhaps turn some of them to peaceful purposes with, I don't know, tourist resorts or whatever, but we don't have ports in China. We should not let them have ports here. We could, anyway, there's a few. I'll just show you some of the pictures of the developments. So you've seen that one. These are just some of the things. Sorry. Anyway, there's more pictures, but I just can't find a way of getting them up. I think that's an up-to-date picture. We could persuade China to revert these islands to peaceful purposes, and if the islands are suitable. I mean, there's a number of options here, but as a parent, I call having boundaries tough love, and that is what is needed here. And all ideas on resolving this are welcome. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Did a very good political statement. Okay. All right.